I wasn't looking for mud flood survivors when I started this investigation. I was researching something far more mundane: the architectural inconsistencies in 19th century municipal buildings across Central Europe. I had been cataloging photographs from city archives in Vienna, Warsaw, and Prague, specifically documenting the unusual ground floor fenestration patterns that kept appearing in structures dated to the 1840s and 1850s. Windows positioned below street level, doorways that open into what modern engineers now classify as basement spaces, but which, if you examine the original blueprints, were clearly designed as ground floor entrances. I assumed it was a regional stylistic quirk. I assumed it had a simple explanation. Then I found the reports, buried inside a digitized collection from the Municipal Archive of Krakow, a collection that had been partially cataloged and then, inexplicably, left incomplete, were 47 handwritten field reports filed between 1871 and 1889. They were written by surveyors working under the Imperial Land Registry, and they describe something that no architectural historian I have since spoken to has ever been willing to discuss on record. These surveyors were documenting the discovery of inhabited subterranean spaces beneath cities that were, according to every official map and census record, entirely above ground. Not tunnels, not sewers, not storage vaults, rooms, furnished rooms with ventilation systems, with carved wooden furniture sealed in thick layers of hardened silt, and in at least 11 of the documented cases, with evidence of very recent human habitation. When I brought these reports to a professor of urban history at a major European university, she looked at them for a long moment, handed them back, and told me they were outside her area of specialization. That was the moment the official explanations began to collapse. Let me tell you exactly what these reports contained, because the specificity is what makes them impossible to dismiss. The first report, filed on the 14th of March, 1871, by a surveyor named Josef Wierzbicki, describes an excavation on the western edge of Krakow's Old Town district, approximately 40 meters from the corner of what is now Ulica Grodska. Workers digging a foundation for a new municipal drainage project broke through a layer of compacted gray clay approximately 2 meters and 30 centimeters below the existing street level. Below that clay layer, which Wierzbicki describes as uniformly compressed, showing no stratification consistent with natural geological deposition, they found a room. He measured it himself. 6 meters wide, 9 meters long, ceiling height of 3 meters and 40 centimeters. The walls were plastered and painted. The paint, he notes, was in remarkably good condition, given what he estimated to be its age. The floor was wooden, partially preserved beneath a layer of fine gray sediment that had entered through a ventilation shaft in the northern wall. The furniture was still in the room. Wierzbicki's report itemizes it with the precision of a man who understood he was documenting something significant. A table, rectangular, constructed from dark hardwood, with carved detailing along the apron that he compares to ecclesiastical woodwork of the mid-18th century. 4 chairs, a cabinet with iron fittings, still locked. And on the table, this is the detail that stopped me cold when I first read it, a ceramic cup, glazed intact, still containing a residue of what Wierzbicki describes as a dark-dried substance consistent in appearance with coffee or chicory preparation. He had a chemist examine it. The chemist's assessment, appended to the report, confirms organic material of likely botanical origin. Someone had been sitting at that table. Someone had been drinking from that cup, and then the clay had come down 2 meters and 30 centimeters of it, uniform and compressed, sealing everything beneath it. Wierzbicki's report was not unusual. It was one of 47. The photographs that accompany several of these reports, glass plate negatives, 9 of which survived in the Krakow archive, have a grain and chemical signature consistent with the wet collodion process that was standard between 1855 and 1880. I had them assessed by a photographic historian who specializes in 19th century documentation. She confirmed the emulsion chemistry, the characteristic halation around light sources, and the mechanical vignetting pattern produced by the specific lens formats in use during that period. These photographs predate the technology required to fabricate them convincingly. The grain matched. The shadows fell correctly. The tonal range was consistent with available light inside enclosed underground spaces, Photograph with the long exposure times necessary before orthochromatic film. What the photograph shows a row of rooms, not a single anomalous chamber, but a sequence of connected spaces, stretching beneath the street in a configuration that mirrors, almost exactly, the floor plan of the buildings above them, the same proportions, the same room divisions, as if the structures we see above ground are a second layer, built on top of a first layer that was never properly evacuated, never properly recorded, and never properly explained. The official explanation, when I eventually found one reference in a 1923 academic paper from the University of Woe, was that these spaces represented medieval storage cellars that had been abandoned during the Ottoman incursions of the 17th century and gradually filled with natural flood sediment. The paper cited no primary sources. It made no reference to the Wiersbecke reports or to any of the 47 documents I found. I checked. It simply asserted the explanation as established fact and moved on. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Krakow was not isolated. Once I understood what I was looking for, once I had a framework built from those 47 reports, I began finding the same pattern in archives across 4 continents. Not similar patterns, not analogous phenomena. The same pattern, repeating with unsettling precision. In St. Petersburg, the municipal excavation records from 1860 to 1895, held in the Central State Historical Archive and partially available through a digitization project that was, notably, suspended without explanation in 2019, contained 32 instances of subterranean room discoveries during infrastructure projects. The depth is consistent, between 1 meter 80 centimeters and 2 meters 60 centimeters below existing street level. The clay layer composition is consistent, and in 9 of the 32 St. Petersburg cases, the discovery reports note evidence of recent habitation, not ancient habitation, recent, ashen fireplaces that had not fully carbonized, food material in sealed containers. In one report from 1877, describing a discovery beneath the Vasily-Ostrovsky district, the surveyor notes the presence of a hanging oil lamp that still contained approximately a quarter measure of lamp oil. In Buenos Aires, the records are harder to access, but the archive of the province of Buenos Aires holds construction reports from the 1880s and 1890s documenting underground chambers discovered during the installation of the first city sewage network. 7 documented instances, depth consistent with the European findings. The surveyors who wrote these reports used the Spanish word habitados, inhabited, not as a historical assessment, but as a present-tense observation. In Delhi, the colonial survey records maintained by the Archaeological Survey of India from 1870 to 1910 contain 14 references to subterranean room complexes discovered during British infrastructure development. The British surveyors, with characteristic colonial terseness, classified them as ancient native storage and moved on, but the dimensions are identical to what Wiersbecke measured in Krakow: 6-meter widths, 9 to 10-meter lengths, ceiling heights between 3 and 3.5 meters. The proportions repeat with a specificity that cannot be attributed to coincidence. If these were genuinely independent cultural phenomena arising from separate historical traditions across Poland, Russia, Argentina, and India, the measurements would diverge. They do not diverge. They converge. The same depth, the same clay, the same proportions, all across a time window that points consistently to the same period, the late 17th to early 18th century, somewhere between 1650 and 1750. Depending on the location, something happened that buried the ground floors of an entire global civilization beneath a uniform layer of compressed sediment. And the people who survived, some of them, survived underground. Who were they built for? The reports I found in Krakow were not the only documentary record. There was a period, roughly 1860 to 1920, during which the popular press reported on these discoveries with frequency that suggests they were not considered unusual. They were considered newsworthy, but not extraordinary. They were simply part of life in a rapidly industrializing world that kept digging holes and finding things. The Viennese Municipal Courier, 1874. A report describes workers on a ring road expansion breaking into a series of connected underground rooms near the Schottentor district. The journalist notes, without apparent alarm, that the rooms contained household effects, and that the lower walls showed evidence of long-term occupation. The article speculates briefly about the room's origins and concludes with a line that has stayed with me. The inhabitants, whoever they may have been, kept house as carefully as any family in Vienna today. The St. Petersburg Illustrated Gazette, 1882, a correspondent covering the Nevsky Prospect Drainage Project, describes a subterranean discovery of what he calls a complete domestic installation, a kitchen area with a stone hearth, adjacent sleeping quarters, and a locked storage room containing preserved foodstuffs. He interviews the chief engineer, who declines to speculate on the age of the installation. The article runs on page 4. Below a notice about a new theater production. The Buenos Aires Standard, 1891. 3 paragraphs describing a curious subterranean dwelling discovered by workers on the Avenida de Mayo construction project. The dwelling, the report notes, appears to have been inhabited within living memory. No follow-up article was ever published. The Delhi Illustrated Times, 1897. A colonial correspondent describes the discovery of underground rooms during expansion works near the old city. He writes with a dismissive brevity typical of colonial journalism, but even he notes that the rooms contain personal effects, clothing, sealed jars, a child's wooden toy that showed no signs of significant age. He attributes it to native squatters and moves on. The Chicago Construction Record, 1909, a technical journal, not a popular newspaper, describes the discovery of 2 connected rooms during foundation work on the south side. The engineer's report attached to the journal article gives dimensions consistent with every other discovery I have documented. He requests further investigation. There is no record that any investigation was conducted. After approximately 1920, the reports stop, not gradually, not as a function of declining industrial excavation. Abruptly, the photographs stop, the field reports stop, the newspaper articles stop, the maps change, and the Smithsonian Institution, which had maintained an internal correspondence file on what its own archivist had privately labeled subsurface habitation anomalies, closed that file in 1924. I know this because a reference to its closure appears in a footnote in an unrelated 1931 paper on American archaeological methodology. The file itself does not appear in any publicly accessible catalog. The pattern is too consistent to ignore. Let me propose something that sounds absurd until you examine the evidence carefully. What if the mud flood was not a natural disaster? What if it was a managed event, a deliberate, coordinated inundation of existing inhabited territories, executed with sufficient precision to bury the ground floors of an entire continental civilization while leaving the upper stories structurally intact and available for repopulation? What if the buildings we call 19th century architecture are not newly constructed buildings at all, but the upper floors of structures that already existed, simply cleaned, refaced, and redocumented as new construction after the sediment was laid down? The evidence supports this reading in ways that the alternative, natural catastrophic flooding, does not. Natural floods do not deposit uniform, unstructured clay layers across geographically separated continents at consistent depths. Natural floods do not preserve organic material so completely that coffee residue remains viable for chemical analysis 200 years later. Natural floods do not leave furniture standing upright at the correct orientation while filling rooms from the floor up with 2 meters of compacted sediment. The physics do not work. But a managed inundation, a slow, controlled delivery of processed sediment across a prepared territory, could produce exactly what the surveyors found. And who had the organizational capacity to execute something at that scale across multiple continents during the period in question? An entity that appears on maps as a transcontinental political structure, an entity whose administrative reach spanned the exact territory where these discoveries cluster most densely, an entity that was then, in the decades immediately following the period of the inundation, systematically removed from every map, every encyclopedia, every academic text. Why would a civilization erase itself from the record? It would not. But a civilization that displaced another civilization, that covered it over, literally, with meters of earth, and then constructed a new historical narrative on top, would have every reason to ensure the buried civilization remained buried, not just physically, documentarily, intellectually, And the people who survived underground, who kept their lamps lit and their cups full in the sealed rooms below the new streets, were the living proof of what had been done and what had been lost. Here is what I find most revealing about the response to this evidence. It is not aggressive dismissal. It is not organized debunking. When I presented these findings, the Krakow reports, the consistent depths, the newspaper record, the Smithsonian file closure, to academics, to journalists, to institutional archivists, the response is always the same. They don't debate. They pretend it never existed. Not one of the institutions I contact regarding the Krakow archive reports acknowledged receiving my inquiry. The digitization project for the St. Petersburg municipal records, suspended in 2019, was suspended without any public statement. The Buenos Aires Provincial Archive, when I requested copies of the 1880s construction surveys, informed me that records from that period had been transferred to an alternative cataloging system and were temporarily unavailable. That was 3 years ago. They remain temporarily unavailable. It is not active suppression. It is passive erasure. And passive erasure is, in many ways, more effective than active suppression because it leaves no fingerprints, no government memo ordering the destruction of evidence, no institutional directive mandating silence, just an absence, a gradual, consistent, universal absence of engagement with a specific category of historical documentation. This pattern repeats across disciplines. Archaeologists who have published work on anomalous subterranean discoveries, and there are more of them than you might expect, working in the margins of academic journals that most people never read, consistently report the same experience. Their papers are not refuted. They are ignored. Journals decline to publish responses, pro or con. Conference panels on related subjects are scheduled in the smallest rooms, at the least attended time slots, and are then quietly dropped from subsequent programs. A geologist I spoke with who had published a paper examining the clay layer composition in Central European cities described a response from his department as a very polite request to focus on other research areas. He has not published on the subject since. What disciplines would need to coordinate to maintain this silence? History, geology, archaeology, architecture, urban planning, municipal archival science, journalism. That is not a small number of fields. That is the entire institutional apparatus through which we understand the past. And when every one of those fields consistently, independently, across dozens of countries in more than a century, produces the same non-response to the same category of evidence, that is not a coincidence. That is a pattern. And patterns, as I have learned in this investigation, are always pointing somewhere. There is one more category of evidence I need to bring to your attention, because it closes a gap that the documentary record alone cannot close. The tools. In the process of documenting the subterranean room discoveries, several of the surveyors, and this is consistent across the Krakow, St. Petersburg, and Delhi reports, catalog tools found in the rooms, not the domestic implements you might expect, industrial tools, precision tools. In 3 of the Krakow cases, the items described include what Wierzbicki and his colleagues identify as measuring instruments, devices with brass fittings, calibrated scales, and adjustment mechanisms that they struggle to categorize. In one instance, Wierzbicki sketches a device in the margin of his report, a rough pencil drawing, but detailed enough to be meaningful. It shows cylindrical brass housing approximately 30 centimeters in length, with a series of nested adjustment rings marked with fine gradations and an eyepiece at one end. He labels it instrument of unknown purpose, possibly optical. That description and that sketch match a category of precision optical and survey instrument that, according to the official history of scientific instrumentation, was not developed until the late 19th century. The room it was found in, based on the clay layer depth and organic material analysis, was sealed no later than the early 18th century. When I brought this sketch to the attention of the curator of scientific instruments at a major European museum, I will not name the museum, as the curator spoke to me informally and off the record, she examined it for several minutes. She said it resembled a category of instrument held in their collection that had been acquired at auction in 1931, provenance listed as Central European, manufacturer unknown. She said the auction catalog had listed it simply as decorative brass object. It was 43 centimeters long, nested adjustment rings, optical eyepiece, filed as decorative, stored in a secondary collection, not displayed. I asked her what she thought it was. She said she had always thought it was a precision survey instrument of a type inconsistent with any known manufacturer from the period of its attributed construction. She had noted this in an internal assessment in 2014. The assessment had been filed. Nothing had happened. And suddenly the tool in Wiersbecke sketch isn't an anomaly anymore. It's confirmation. I keep returning to those 47 reports from Krakow, to the image of Josef Wiersbecke standing in a sealed room 2 meters below the streets of a city he thought he understood, looking at a ceramic cup with coffee still dried at the bottom, and writing it all down in his careful imperial surveyor's hand, because that was what he'd been trained to do. He documented what he found. He filed his reports. And then nothing. No official response. No academic paper. No engineering recommendation. No follow-up excavation. Why would 11 separate rooms across a single city show evidence of very recent habitation and generate no formal investigation? Why would surveyors across 5 countries, working independently and without knowledge of each other's findings, document the same depths, the same clay composition, the same proportions, over the same 50-year period, and produce a body of evidence that then disappears from every accessible institutional record? Why would the Smithsonian close a file on subsurface habitation anomalies in 1924 without any published explanation, in the same decade that newspapers stopped reporting on underground discoveries at all? Why would a precision instrument inconsistent with any known manufacturing tradition from its attributed period be cataloged as a decorative object and stored away from public view? Why would the maps change? Not coincidence, not regional variation, not independent anomalies pattern, a pattern that stretches across continents and centuries, always pointing toward the same buried moment, the same buried people, the same buried truth. I don't have definitive answers. I have never claimed to. What I have are questions, and the uncomfortable weight of evidence that suggests the questions are the right ones. Someone survived the event that buried the ground floors of a civilization. Some of them survived underground, in the rooms the surveyors found. Some of them may have survived long enough to speak to people who are now also gone or silenced, or simply not listened to. And the civilization that rose above them, our civilization, the one that built its streets on top of the clay, that repopulate the upper floors and call them new construction, that filed the reports and then quietly ensured the reports were never read. That civilization had every reason to ensure those survivors and their testimony remained buried alongside the rooms they lived in. What have we forgotten? What were we never supposed to remember? I don't know. I genuinely do not know. What I know is that somewhere beneath the streets of Krakow and St. Petersburg and Buenos Aires and Delhi and Chicago and dozens of other cities whose archives I have not yet had the opportunity to examine, there are rooms. Some of them have been opened and resealed by infrastructure projects that moved on without recording what they found. Some of them are still sealed. Some of them, and this is the part one cannot stop thinking about, still contain the objects that someone left behind when they finally came back up into the light of a world that had already decided they had never existed. The buildings still stand above them. The clay is still down there. And whatever was sealed beneath, it is still waiting to be found.